Well, good morning, friends. I'm Kevin, pastor for Crosswind Community Church, and I'm glad you're joining me today for this word from the Bible. Today we're going to be looking briefly at a passage from the book of Philippians. It's found in Philippians chapter 4, and we're going to be looking at the last half of verse 11 through verse 13. And this morning I'm going to be reading to you from a bit different translation than I normally do. I'm going to be reading today from the Contemporary English Bible. And here's what Paul has to say for us today. I have learned how to be content in any circumstance. I know the experience of being in need and of having more than enough. I have learned the secret to being content in any and every circumstance, whether full or hungry, or whether having plenty or being poor. I can endure all these things through the power of the one who gives me strength. May God add a blessing to the reading of that word. So, have you ever started something new, something different? I don't know, maybe it was a new job, or maybe you were starting a new hobby or a new exercise program, a new eating program, a new relationship. Whatever it was, you were starting something new that was going to be a little bit maybe difficult and challenging for you. And as you began that new thing, did you ever have that worry, that thought in your mind, whether or not you would have the strength and the fortitude to finish it? You know, I think back to several years back, I took up as kind of a spiritual discipline, I took up backpacking as a hobby. And I bought all the equipment, and I worried, would I be able to cover the miles that I wanted to cover? Would I be able to carry a backpack on my back and walk 12 to 15 miles in a day? And what I found was I'm a flatlander, and I could do that fairly well without too much physical challenge back then in Michigan. But I would have never been able to do that same thing on, say, the Appalachian Trail. It would have been too difficult for me to finish. But as I began that, and maybe you can experience this with me if you've started something, you know, in my case, will my lungs hold out? Will my body hold out? Or will I collapse partway through? And we can think that same thing if we've started a new exercise routine in these days of being hunkered down at home. Many of us are trying to exercise more. Will my lungs and my body hold up to this new exercise routine? Or maybe it's something a little more personal and a little closer to home for many of us. We're in the midst of perhaps caring for a loved one who has an illness. And will I be able to see my loved one through that illness? Will I have the fortitude to see them through, or will I lose heart somewhere in the midst of that circumstance? Well, Paul's claim today in our verses from Philippians is that no matter what task is set before him or what trials he has or will have to endure, he has found strength in Christ to be completely sufficient. And I love that description. However, quite often we like to go on and say that we like to make these verses sound as if Paul is saying that he can do all things through Christ who gives him strength. And while that's not completely wrong, it's not completely true. In other words, I will physically never be able to flap my arms hard enough to fly. I will never physically be 6'5". There's lots of things that I will never be able to do in the strength of Christ. And so I say all this a bit facetiously, but I want us to understand how we quote this verse, because quite often we quote this off the top of our head as, I can do all things in Christ who gives me strength. when a better way to put that would be, I can endure all things through Christ who strengthens me. In other words, we need to think about what Paul is writing about in these verses. In verse 11, I read for you, Paul says, I've learned how to be content in any circumstance. And then the very next verse, in verse 12, he writes, I have learned the secret of being content in every circumstance. You see, this is a wonderful verse. This is a wonderful passage. It is truly full of good news for us, and it's about the good news that we can be content in any circumstance. And so I want to leave you with just this one last thought. And I believe this was Paul's thought when he was writing these words to the church in Philippi, is that Christ is always completely enough. No matter what circumstance we find ourselves in, no matter what struggle we find ourselves in, whether it's physical or whether it's emotional, we need to always remember, we can carry this promise with us, if you will, that Christ is always completely enough. Well, friends, I hope that you found some meaning in what you heard here today. And I pray that as you continue growing in your faith in Jesus Christ, that you will also continue to find God's blessings all around you in the midst of any circumstance. And in that, I hope that you will also find ways to be a blessing for others. I will look forward to seeing you in my kitchen with a cup of coffee or tea again on Monday morning. Have a wonderful weekend. God bless.